Hello, everyone, and welcome to Open Democracy Weekly Live Discussion. Tonight's debate is brought to you in partnership with Safer World for the Truth initiative, and we'll hear about it in a few moments. My name is Yama Siawash. I will be your chair tonight, and we want to make this conversation as interactive as possible to involve you as much as we can. A particular thanks to all of you who submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We try and go and address all of them, or at least as many of them as possible. If you're joining us on Zoom and you have a question or comment for us, please click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window your question or comment. And people watching on Facebook can put their questions in comments. Tonight's debate is going to be about a very topical issue. It's entitled Killing the Truth. What can we do about journalists' murders? Now, as you can imagine, it's that time of the year where my own organization, too, for instance, but also many other press freedom organizations are actually busy putting out or finalizing our annual reports about journalists killed in the line of duty. It's always a harrowing experience for anybody involved in that work, but of course that doesn't compare in importance to the loss and grief of the families of those who are killed and their colleagues. But it certainly leaves us with a duty never to forget and to always speak about it and always remember them and always fight for justice. And tonight's debate is exactly about that. We're talking about killing the truth. What can we do about journalists' murders? And to address this debate, we have a very exciting lineup of panelists. I will introduce them to you. We have Jos Midas Bartman. He's a research coordinator at the Safer World for the Truth project, and he's associated with Press Freedom Unlimited, where he is investigating cold cases of murdered journalists. We also have Lana Estemirova, host of the Trouble with the Truth podcast, produced in partnership with Justice for Journalists Foundation. And we have Haydee Dijkstal, a UK barrister at the Bedford Row Chambers, who has represented the family of murdered Afghan journalist Yama Siawash. So to start us off, I will talk to each of our panelists, and let me start by Mr. Bartman, if I may. Mr. Bartman, your title and the role you play in investigating cold cases of murdered journalists is actually very topical. Could you just say in a few words what it involves, please?
Hi, Ernest. Thanks for having me. Yes, I'm the research coordinator of the Safer World for the Truth project, which is part of the Committee to Protect Journalists, Free Press Unlimited, and Reporters Without Borders. And what we basically do is we investigate cold cases of journalist murders. As we probably will discuss today, an important element of impunity is the fact that way too often when it comes to journalist murders, investigations are not conducted in a thorough and effective manner. And what we aim to do is we aim to unearth new findings when it comes to journalist murders, particularly cold cases of journalist killings, and eventually pursue justice. One thing we do is, of course, we document these cases very well. But the second thing is that we do is we try to pursue justice in a context-specific manner. For example, by collaborating with human rights lawyers and the family to eventually have a chance of justice for the bereaved people.
Right, and you probably have come across so many cases. Indeed, you may be spoiled for choice if you want to pursue any given case of murdered journalists. What would you say are the main obstacles in your role? How do you go about documenting those cases?
That's an interesting one. Well, unfortunately, there are many cases indeed. That is really context specific, I would say. Um, I would say I think it's good to roughly distinguish between two contexts. One is a context of a severe lack of institutional capacity. For example, when we're talking of countries like the Central African Republic, where there are basically no well-functioning investigative bodies and prosecutorial bodies at hand. And another one is impunity in context of well-functioning institutions, but institutions that are fairly unaccountable and severely crippled. For example, countries like Pakistan or Mexico. Well, it starts, I think, quite early within the investigative process. At least the cases that we see actually have errors from the start, from the analysis of the crime scene investigation, up to the interviewing of witnesses. One problem that we see, for example, in the context of countries with mixed institutions, such as Mexico and Pakistan, is that rarely the work of a journalist is taken into account when it comes to these investigations. So that's something we often find ourselves doing ourselves. We have to go to the archives to begin with to see what a journalist wrote prior to his or her death, and make a thorough analysis of the threats that were directed towards this person. These are often things. Very simple things that you would expect from a murder investigation that often go wrong. Yeah.
Well, can I follow up on that? Because you did mention lack of capability in some countries, but also, interestingly, dysfunctioning institutions in some countries which are supposed to be stable. Is there any possibility or any likelihood at all of bringing private prosecutions when there has been none at all from this government, this state?
It depends, I think, on what you mean with private prosecutions. I think that, so what we do, we are not engaged in private prosecutions. In the context that we work, and I think it counts for many countries, when it comes to a murder, that's quite complicated and sometimes not even possible. But what we can do, and to take the case of Zubair Mujahid, a journalist that was murdered in 2007 in Pakistan, as an example, we can collaborate with human rights lawyers and the family in order to sort of act as assistant prosecutors that are operating next to public prosecutors on the case. So in the case of Zubair Mujahid, currently the son of Zubair Mujahid, together with human rights lawyers, are actually filing a petition that requests the High Court of Sindh to order a reopening of the investigation. And we've played an active part in that process. I think these things are very much possible. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, indeed. And finally, for now, can we get some sense of your understanding? Your project is aptly called actually, Safer World for the Truth. What is the impact of a world without the truth? What does it represent for the ordinary people?
If there is a world without the truth?
The truth, yes.
Well, I think it's almost needless to say that it's that will be a miserable world. That's not the world we want to live in, at least from a democratic perspective. That's deeply troubling. If we, in light of democracy and in light of elections, decisions should be made when there is a free flow of information within the public sphere. If that's not the case, these decisions cannot be made, and elections are, for that matter, fictitious. So it is hugely important, and there are other importances, of course. In the cases of civil conflict or rapidly deteriorating security situations, journalists are often play a crucial role in providing information about security, about advance of rebel movements, for example. If journalists cannot function and this information is not flowing freely anymore, it has a direct impact on the security of civilians, of course.
Indeed, very much so. Well, I'm sure you echo what our colleague Maria Ressa, who won the Peace Nobel Prize, said that without truth, there will be no trust. And I think that's exactly what you were driving at. Thank you very much, Mr. Bartman. And we'll be back to you in a few moments, of course, with questions and answers session. Now, let me move on to Lana Estemirova. She's the host of the Trouble the Truth, a podcast produced in partnership with the Justice for Journalists Foundation. Lana, again, same question. Could you just take a few minutes and tell us what you exactly do and what do you cover on your podcast, please?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. It's an honor to share this panel with you. So I'll just talk briefly about my organization, Justice for Journalists Foundation, because it was actually born out of tragedy. In 2018, 3 Russian journalists, Arkhan Jamal, Alexander Rastorguyev, and Kirill Radchenko, 3 journalists, were murdered in Central African Republic while they were investigating Russian private contractors, the Wagner Group, a very notorious and dangerous organization. And yeah, all these years later, their murderers haven't been found, and there is some kind of a never-ending kind of blame game coming from Central African Republic that doesn't really have the infrastructure to investigate murder of this kind. And, you know, there are strong hints that it might be implicated in this murder. And Russia, that's basically not interested in investigating it, because Russia has its own bloody history with murdered journalists and activists whose families still haven't seen justice. And so our organization was set up, and we have 3 main goals: is to help journalists with their safety. Basically, we hold trainings for them, safety trainings, and while we don't guarantee that these kind of things that they learn at our trainings will save their lives, we really hope that they can help them in one way or another. We also document attacks on journalists, physical, online, and we all put them on a map. At the moment, it's the sort of post-Soviet space, because it's a very extensive work and there's just a few of us, although of course it would be great if we had this map of the world and perhaps other organizations can help out. And also we actually, one of the most important things is that we provide grants for journalists and organizations that help to investigate attacks on journalists and murders of journalists. And we actually help to provide funds with several major investigations. Because as we find out, unfortunately, it's the journalists and the private citizens that are more skillful and more effective in investigating the murders of journalists than states and police. And the states are often the ones covering all the evidence up. And speaking about my podcast, so yeah, it was an idea that was born out of a conversation about journalists and their investigations and how they kind of stay behind the scenes. And with the podcast, I actually wanted to shine light on these reporters from all over the world, not the very famous ones, just the ones who are doing their work quietly day to day. And I interviewed journalists from all over the world, from Mexico and Turkey, Belarus, Central African Republic as well, although that was very anonymous because it's very, very dangerous. And this pattern of impunity and the same occurring problems that keep appearing from country to country, regardless of where it is something that unfortunately, it really struck me. And now I can just see this pattern and I can hear the same words coming out of the mouth of people who've never met each other. And it's very troubling. And Jos, you mentioned Mexico before, and here's a staggering statistics for you. About 99% of the cases of journalist murders end with impunity. I couldn't believe it when I first heard that, and I had to double check it. 99%. It's really hard to comprehend that dozens and dozens of journalists who lose their lives, they're just completely disposable. And you know, it seems like no one can do anything about it. So when the question is posed, what can we do to prevent these murders? Honestly, it requires such a complex, multi-layered structure, I think, on so many levels that I hope we can explore it during our discussion, because, you know, I have a few ideas, but it would be great to hear from you as well.
Well, thank you very much. And let me add that we welcome you, your organization, in the partnership with the Council of Europe on its platform for the promotion of journalists and the safety of journalists. So you are the newest member, but of course a very valued new member. Could I ask you, in your podcast, do you so much target governments or just the general public to raise awareness about this particular situation?
Well, I really hope that some government representatives listen to my podcast. I think it starts with the public, to be honest, because we need to make these problems heard, because we often find, I mean, I'm very familiar, obviously, because since I'm from Chechnya, with the problems that Russian independent media faces. And, it often happens that all these struggles of journalists, especially from the regions, they, they're just fall on deaf ears. And that's why I think raising awareness and making the audience hear that there is so much effort, to hear about all the effort that it takes for journalists to deliver stories to their screens. I think it can already make a difference, because if general public is not aware of this, then we can't really make a difference. That's why campaigning and enlightenment these are such important tools to actually force the government and force structures above us to actually make a difference.
Absolutely. I think the outreach that you engaged in is very, very important for success of the campaign. And just last one for the moment. You've been now dealing with this issue for a couple of years because you told us you started with the killing of the 3 colleagues in the Central African Republic. I remember those cases. Why do you think governments are so reluctant, even a case which, like these cases, they happen far away from Moscow, let's say from their country? Why do you think there is very little effort in finding out what has happened to them for their families and their colleagues? What do you think is driving that kind of reluctance?
Well, I can say with confidence about Russia in particular is that Russia and the Russian government, the reason why they're not investigating these murders is actually, it means that they would have to investigate themselves, because there are quite strong links between representatives of advisors to Putin, such as Yevgeny Prigozhin, and the Wagner group that Arkhan and his colleagues were investigating. And the Wagner group, which is a private military contractor, have also been providing help with elections. They've been consulting the government and various groups in the Central African Republic. They've been providing private security protection, etc., etc. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is linked to this group and who's called Putin's chef, he has very close links with the Russian government. Although, of course, he likes to be incognito, and he doesn't like his picture taken. A lot of journalists, incredibly brave journalists who are lucky to be alive, they're uncovered these links. That's why, to put it simply, the Russian government is not interested in investigating these murders because it's implicated in these murders.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Lana. For now, we will again be back to you during the question and answer session. And let me now come to our final panelist. I think we're very fortunate to have Haydee Dijkstal, because she's a senior lawyer. She's a barrister in London. She has represented a family of a kid journalist from Afghanistan. So, Haydee, could you please help us here? What could the legal profession that you represent contribute to the end of impunity for crime against journalists?
Thank you very much, Ernest. And I just want to also thank openDemocracy and A Safer World for the Truth for planning this discussion and inviting me to participate. If I could just explain my role a bit.
Sure.
First. So as Ernest had said before, I'm a barrister in London. I'm also a US attorney. And my practice focuses on international criminal law and international human rights law. And so for international criminal law, I've practiced before international tribunals. And for international human rights law, practicing representing victims of human rights abuses before places like the UN, European Court on Human Rights, or the African Commission and Court, and on issues that have to do with rights to free expression and association, fair trial rights, detention violations, torture, a host of things. But I come here today because some of the work that I've done is regarding the right to free expression and the rights of journalists who have had either crimes committed against them or human rights violations. And as Ernest mentioned before, I represent the family of Afghan journalist Yama Siawash, who was known in Afghanistan for reporting on controversial political and important issues, and also for doing that in a way that was where he posed tough, challenging, hard-hitting questions on his television program. And he was killed just over a year ago in November 2020, when military-grade explosives that were embedded in the car that was sent to collect him were remotely detonated. So when I approach this discussion today, I am discussing my work in regards to Yama Siawash and his family, but also what's really important is that I'm also addressing the situation for journalists as a whole in Afghanistan, because it mirrors so much what happened to Yama, and you cannot look at that as an isolated incident. And what I think is important is because I come here as a lawyer working with victims of crimes and human rights violations to find justice, accountability, and the truth, I want to highlight the problem of impunity, like the other panelists have done as well, and discuss avenues for addressing those internationally. Now, your question regarded how the legal profession can contribute to ending impunity. Now, remember that as a lawyer, I come in at the point when crimes or abuses have already been committed. And so I'm working with the victim of those crimes or violations or their immediate family members to address a number of different goals. And that can be finding the truth, letting the victims tell their story, trying to find justice and accountability for the perpetrators of the crimes, and also to see if there's a possibility for reparations when that is available. So another thing that I should probably mention as well is that when representing victims of attacks on journalists, this can be the individual journalist who is attacked, but we shouldn't forget that the family members of that journalist are also equally victims because they have suffered an indirect harm. Often when a journalist is killed, that has an enormous impact on the family members. And so as a lawyer, when I'm addressing these crimes and human rights abuses before international bodies, I'm bringing that forward before those places on behalf of the journalist who was targeted, but also on behalf of the family who equally deserve to have the harm that they suffered addressed, because their human rights have also been violated. So, you know, it's about looking at the different international remedies that are available to create pressure to change this pattern of impunity. And that's something that I had wanted to raise because in my experience with representing the family of Yama Siawash and also learning more about the situation for Afghan journalists more widely, I think there's three things that that were key issues and I think are emblematic of what many journalists are facing around the world. And that's First, the pattern of killings. This, as I said before, when a journalist is attacked and killed, particularly in Afghanistan and in so many other places around the world, this is not an isolated incident. And in Afghanistan in particular, it's part of a serious pattern of attacks against not only journalists, but we should also remember members of the media as well, because there's oftentimes cameramen or other individuals who are assisting journalists that are also attacked, targeted, sometimes even killed as well. In Afghanistan, the UN just this year said that Afghanistan is one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists. And that's a reality that's only become more and more evident. There was a reported series of attacks against journalists from 2018 to 2021, where journalists were regularly and frequently attacked and killed. And this continues today, particularly under the new control of Afghanistan by the Taliban. And we shouldn't forget the fact that it's being widely reported now that journalists in Afghanistan are now being beaten, abused, killed, detained, or forced into hiding because of the new reality in Afghanistan. There's also the commonality with the fact that there is this culture of impunity, and this is something that we're all mentioning over and over again. In my representation of the Siawash family, they certainly encountered that domestically in Afghanistan, and I think this is what so many other journalists in Afghanistan and worldwide are confronting, where they're being met with contradictory statements on evidence, a lack of willingness from governments to discuss and be transparent about a genuine investigation. What I think is really telling is the UN reporting that in Afghanistan, 9 out of 10 cases of killings of journalists do not get justice and impunity prevails. There's no credible or transparent investigations. And I think that situation of impunity is only growing larger and more serious in Afghanistan with the ascent to power of the Taliban now. I mean, it's led to the fact that the ICC prosecutor has sought to reopen or to restart the investigation at the ICC because he has concluded that there is no longer the prospect for a genuine and effective domestic investigation in Afghanistan. So the last thing that I just want to highlight that's an issue for so many of these cases and things that we need to consider when we're investigating the cases and also pursuing justice through international remedies is the right to free expression. What this comes down to is that journalists are being targeted in reprisal for their work. And because they're exercising their right to free expression by practicing as journalists and imparting information, imparting opinions, or engaging in discussions on important issues. So when journalists receive threats and attacks for the work they are doing, these abuses are being perpetrated as a result of their free exercise of this fundamental right. And as a secondary to this, the fact that they are being threatened and attacked have the intended consequence very often of suppressing this right as well. And that's something that we should view as key to our approaches to these cases, and remember that this is about a very
yes, indeed.
Right.
Excuse me to butt in, Haydee. You did mention a couple of things I want to touch on again, because indeed, first of all, the case of Afghanistan is clearly a very, very serious case now, at least for this year, not only this year, but at least particularly in this year, because I believe that Afghanistan has got the highest death toll for 2021, with 9 killed. And those are figures we know about. There could be others, but we simply talk about those cases that we have identified. Now, 2 things I want you to touch on. First, given the nature of the government now in Kabul, what could be done to protect those journalists or even bring justice for those who lost their lives? And secondly, you did mention the finding of the UN report that 9 out of 10 cases go unpunished. It's not only on Afghanistan, it's actually global. That's the global situation. If there is nothing that can be done inside Afghanistan, do you think there is any other venue that these cases could be brought to ensure justice is done?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So your first question is what can be done? And I think when there isn't justice available domestically, that's when we start to look at international remedies. And that's where I approach these cases from as well, because my practice is in international law. So we're looking at a number of different venues that could address these crimes. And it depends on, of course, the facts of the situation and different areas of law as well. As I mentioned before, these cases can be addressed under international criminal law and also international human rights law. So to address international criminal law first, I think it's important when applicable to look at the International Criminal Court, particularly when we're seeing journalists being targeted in a pattern of attacks. So it's not an isolated incident, but we're looking at something that's systemic, that's widespread. It could either be a crime against humanity in so many different ways, not only the crime against humanity of murder, but the crime against humanity of persecution, because it's targeting the fundamental human rights of these individuals and an identifiable group or collective of journalists that are acting on political issues. Or we could look at war crimes as well, the war crimes of murder, the war crimes of intentionally attacking civilians when that happens in the context of an armed conflict. So I think that that's one place in particular that we should look at the attacks of journalists as an international crime that deserves attention before these international bodies that adjudicate international criminal law when it's not possible to get justice domestically. And when we're being confronted by these figures like 9 out of 10 cases having impunity, or as Lana said, 99% of cases not having any justice at all. But then we can also look simultaneously at international human rights law as well, and approaching bodies like the UN and their special procedures, where we approach UN special rapporteurs or other UN bodies to raise the human rights violations against journalists. And, as I said before, this is both against journalists and their families. So when we're looking at the journalists that are attacked or killed, their right to life is being violated, and the right to free expression as well. But for the families, it's the right against arbitrary interference with family life, and the right to a remedy and the truth. And those are fundamental rights that individuals have, the right to get a remedy for what happened to their family members. What I think is important with these two areas of law, international criminal, international human rights laws, how they can work together. Because I think, as we know, international justice takes time, and it's a process. It could take years and years. So building that pressure for either states to act and to provide that genuine justice because it's being brought to international remedies, or seeking them in different places, in the International Criminal Court or UN bodies or other human rights venues. I mean, we can also look to the People's Tribunal for Murdered Journalists, which A Safer World for the Truth recently was involved with. And the important work that they're doing in the face of impunity and in the face of the fact that international criminal and human rights bodies do take so much time to get to the point where they might hopefully provide some kind of justice, but oftentimes it's not possible for every victim to get justice before these bodies. So looking at people's tribunals to preserve that evidence, to allow the victims to tell their story, or we could also look to universal jurisdiction. So I think you had mentioned before private prosecutions, but the universal jurisdiction mechanisms in countries that allow it will allow victims to bring criminal complaints themselves to prosecutors and try to start these investigations. Or the last thing that I want to mention is the possibility of the Media Freedom Coalition or the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom and engaging that body as well. I know that it's a new body and it's a bit unclear what their mandate is, but we need to be looking at all of the resources necessary. And I think that's the overall point with getting justice, is we look to as many places as possible to try to create an overwhelming momentum towards justice, and doing this simultaneously in order to try to get to the point where there is justice and it creates a deterrent for further crimes and continued impunity.
Well, thank you very much, Haydee. Thank you very much for that. Listen, we've been talking now for over half an hour, and I'm told that there are about 113 people patiently waiting for their turn. We should give them the opportunity to ask their questions, as some of them are actually in the system already. But before we get into those questions, can I let you know that there was a podcast about a Mexican journalist, Regina Martinez, which was published yesterday by the openDemocracy, together with Safer for Truth, the project we mentioned, Safer Word for the Truth. So please go online and have a listen to that. And I'm sure there'll be more podcasts on more journalists killed in days and years to come. And now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. We are now going to be able to go through as many questions as we possibly can. And to start with your questions, I wonder if I can stay with Haydee for a moment, because the first question says, can we sue our governments for failing their people, lies, gross negligence, cronyism, incompetence, and environmental damage, etc.? And let me link it to the second question, and then you can have a go at those two. Are there any specific international laws to protect journalism? Would you like to answer those questions first, Haydee, and then I'll get other panelists to also chip in, please?
So the first question is geared towards how we can hold governments accountable for the obligations they have to seeking the truth, to providing a remedy, and to protecting fundamental rights of individuals. Now, many of these countries have signed up to international human rights documents and treaties in which there's a number of rights that are listed, and by signing up for those treaties, those governments have agreed to protect those rights, and when they're violated, to ensure that there's accountability and a remedy for those rights. So when we talk about how we can take action against a government for failing to do that, I think it's where I look is in the international human rights sphere. And so when we're lodging human rights complaints, it is about the government's failure to protect those rights. And even if a human right is violated by an individual or a citizen, it does not take away the obligation of the government to address that right. So this is, I think, one of the functions, or one of the mechanisms where governments can be held to account and can be pressured to create a system where human rights are not only protected, but when they are violated, that they're addressed and that there's redress for that. When you bring in a human rights complaint, you're asking for the body where you bring it before, whether it's a UN or a regional court like the African Commission or European Court of Human Rights, to make an official finding and to say that this government has failed to either protect those rights, they have violated them themselves, or failed to remedy those rights. And after making that finding, a body can make recommendations to that state to correct those errors. And as far as specific laws, I think I'm going to refer to human rights laws that are fundamentals, the right to free expression, the right to freedom of association, the right to life. Those are fundamental rights that protect journalists.
Thank you very much. This one is for you, Lana, if you want to please address it. How does the panel feel about raising money to pay for self-defense training for investigative journalists? I think that's your domain. Could you very briefly share your views about this? I think you're mute.
I was on mute, yeah. I think it's actually very crucial, and we're seeing that these kind of measures, these crowdfunding campaigns for lawsuits will become more and more of a norm. Justice for Journalists Foundation just recently actually held a conference with our partners, FPC, called anti-slaps. What can we do to deal with slap cases? And slap cases are strategic lawsuits against public participations. They're basically targeting journalists who are investigating something controversial or something inconvenient for individuals, corporations, or states, and they get persecuted for that. They're facing legal persecution. And although it's not as immediate or as as devastating as a bullet or as a murder or a kidnapping, it can ruin media outlets, it can ruin individuals, journalists, and it can silence the truth truly, and it forces media outlets into self-censorship, basically, as they're forced to retract their statements and change their narratives and issue apologies. So that's actually a matter of public importance. That's why I think crowdfunding campaigns in this case are essential. And there are already different initiatives and organizations that are helping to build funds for these kind of never-ending legal battles. And the last thing that I read, I think Joe Biden and his team proposed a massive legal fund that actually helps journalists to carry out these legal battles. But unfortunately, as we've seen with recent cases, one of the ones that I covered from a podcast was Claire Rucastle Brown, who uncovered one MDB scandal in Malaysia. And she was almost financially ruined by all these multiple dozens of lawsuits that she was facing in the British courts. And she was even forced to remortgage her house and put her son's education at stake. So this is a very serious issue. And until recently, I think it didn't get as much attention as it had to get, because I guess it's not as flashy as, it's a horrible way to say it, but it's not as flashy as someone who goes to jail or gets murdered, but it's equally detrimental to truth getting out and prevailing. That's why I think as long as there are oligarchs and powerful individuals who think that they can silence often poor journalists with a bunch of lawsuits and formidable lawyer, I think that we need to band together as individuals and truth seekers to protect them, even if it means sometimes paying out of the pocket. And, I always encourage our listeners usually to chip in whenever there's some kind of big lawsuit involved. And I think as soon as these law cases are normalized, and there are dozens of them happening all over the world, I think we'll have to help the journalists as well, because it's in all of our interests to do so.
Thank you very much. For the sake of time, we're going to have to have very, very precise and concise answers. This one is for you, Jos, and I'm going to give you two because I think they are linked. The first one says, how does the panel feel about, how does the demonization of investigative journalists and weaponization of information, particularly on social media, feed threat? Hold on to that. And the other one is, are violent acts against journalists reflective of a resistance to free press or the fear of defamation? Could you address those two together, please, Joe, in a minute or so?
Yeah, of course. Can you repeat the last one? I didn't hear the first bit of the last one.
Are violent acts against journalists reflective of a resistance to free press or of the fear of defamation? Yeah.
Well, the answer to the last question is yes, to be really short and precise. And that counts for the first question too. It needs little explanation that there is also something called a climate of impunity and a climate of fear. And obviously threats and the like are contributing greatly to that. And of course, this specifically counts for investigative journalism. We often look at journalists as one sort of like unified concept. But if we look at the subpopulation of investigative journalists, for example, in a country like Mexico that's been previously mentioned, I think statistics will start to look even much worse than if we look at the entire population of journalists. So the answer is yes, and it's hugely important to look at that because investigative journalists fulfill a very specific and important role, also in light of liberal democracy, and threatening them is of course a huge threat to the provision of information, and often, unfortunately, preludes crimes such as murder.
Thank you very much. And this question, I think we have answered it. I think it's from Ali Behzad from Afghanistan. And his question is there any solution to prevent journalists from being killed? I believe we have covered that one quite substantially, so we can move on. Since you mentioned Mexico, a question from Jeremy Fox says, Mexico is the country with which I am most familiar year in, year out. It is a country with the world's highest number of murders of journalists, 7 so far this year. Very few of these murders are investigated. I'm trying to look for the question. Some are undoubtedly carried out by organized crime cartels, and they often take place in areas which are only nominally under the control of the federal government. How can we help? That's a very good question, very, very legitimate question. With that one, who do you want to take it for a minute or so?
Yeah, I would be willing to
yes,
to take it, but if anybody else wants to.
Yes, we can share that minute.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, it's very much true that Mexico is one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists, at least murderous states. Whether it's the most dangerous one, I don't know. That's, I think, a different thing. But I think there are ways to counter impunity. I do not agree that in many of these areas the federal government is not in control. In the Mexican system, the federal government is not completely responsible for law and order, for the provision of law and order. These are also the states, and states, I think, are often complicit in the murder when it comes to the murder of journalists. There has been a prosecution in the case of the murdered journalist Miroslava Breach recently by the special prosecutor for crimes against journalists on the federal level, and I think that's a hugely important step in the curbing of impunity in the Mexican context. These things, I think, take place also in light of increased criticism towards the Mexican government and towards Mexican state institutions. I think we cannot underestimate the role that journalists play in these contexts, like Mexico, that also report about these journalists, but also, for example, the work like Lana is doing. I think it's hugely important to keep on writing and keep on reporting about the murder of journalists, because state institutions and even judicial institutions are not operating in a vacuum. They are, to a certain degree, sensitive for public pressures, especially in these countries like Mexico, where there are logistics of accountability that are in place, but they're not functioning well. and therefore we should still use them.
Thank you very much, Joe. Since you mentioned Lana, Lana, there is the second part of the question, I think is for you. He says that throwing light on this issue internationally would be useful. However, neither governments nor the mainstream media take much interest. Can we do something about it? And I think this is a regular critique of the, let's say, Western media for not talking enough about cases of key journalists unless they happen to be well-known journalists in the West, for instance. Could you take a minute or so, please, to answer this question?
Absolutely. I mean, I always talk about this, and that was actually one, although we do focus a lot on this kind of post-Soviet space in our research and our documentation of attacks on journalists. With this podcast, I kind of wanted to expand our geography and talk about certain places that don't always get the attention. And once I started looking at different examples in Latin America and in Mexico, I was just completely horrified. But I also noticed, I mean, I don't know if I live in my little bubble, but I just noticed how little attention was being paid to what was happening in these countries, and how it's almost like we live in this, at least I'm based in the UK, so we exist in this Anglosphere where it seems like there's only the US, the UK, and sometimes Australia, and something's going on in Russia every now and then there is big scary China. So I definitely find that we live in this very simplified reality, and although we live in an increasingly on a planet that's getting increasingly smaller and smaller, it seems like we still put ourselves in these little boxes, whereas the problems of media freedom affect us all. It's a universal principle. And if there is attack on journalists that's happening in Mexico, we should care about it here as well. If we think that we share common values, and if we believe in freedom of speech and freedom of expression, etc., etc. And since I found that there was so little attention paid, and not that many people, it seemed, around me even knew that there was this level of impunity, I thought, okay, what this government is actually doing to pressure the Mexican government to actually make a difference. Although, Jos, you mentioned that there is some kind of a rule of law, and it's not just states that are just completely ravaged by drug lords. I mean, I think that there is a reason why the government can get away with this sort of impunity. And I actually think there needs to be more kind of comprehensive pressure applied by the EU, by the United States. And it shouldn't just be about the economy or about some kind of issues on the border. It should look at every single aspect. And media freedom now, especially as it's diminishing all over the world, even in the West, I think that we need to pay close attention to what happens outside of our zone of interest. And although my podcast obviously plays a very, very small role in this, I always encourage people to actually look at what's happening outside their windows and look at what's happening outside their island and outside their continent. And I feel very deeply for the families of those who lost who lost their fathers and their sisters. And I spoke to these journalists, and their stories deeply resonated with me. I mean, sorry that I'm taking too much time, but this one journalist, Andres Solis, who was threatened multiple times and who still continues to do his job, he told me that there is just this small radio station somewhere in this very remote Mexican region that's not, it's not Mexico, it's not the capital, and they were forced to basically censor themselves completely and to stop delivering any kind of news. So now it's just an entertainment music station, radio station. So this huge chunk of the population are not getting their news anymore. So that's extinguishing press freedom, and that's why if it impacts the whole region, it impacts the whole country. And therefore, I absolutely believe that first of all, we need to care about this more in the West, and we need to apply more pressure internationally.
Thank you very much.
Can I just say something?
Yes, please, very quickly.
Very quickly. I just want to echo how important it is that journalists are reporting and investigating on attacks and killing of journalists, and organizations that are doing this work as well. In my capacity as a lawyer, having those reports helps to show the widespread nature of these attacks and to demonstrate that they should be brought before bodies like the International Criminal Court or before human rights bodies. And we rely on those reports. So when journalists self-censor or when it's not reported on outside of that country, it does affect the legal work as well. So I just want to emphasize that it's important as well for the legal work, and very much value that work that journalists and organizations are doing.
Well, thank you very much, Haydee. And there was a question which I think, I'm not sure I can go into that, because somebody asked for whether we can publish in these panels UK law suits. I'm not sure that we can address it. I think it's not very precise. And in any case, we're running out of time. So we're going to have to stop here. And I really want to thank our panelists, Joe, Lana, and Haydee, for your expertise and for having shared your views on this very, very important issue. I want to thank every single one of the members of the audience who very patiently stayed with us for the entire hour. And until next week for the next live discussion by Open Democracy, I want to wish you a very good evening and very good night if you happen to be well. Indeed, it is a night time. And my name is Zane Sagaga. It was a pleasure to be with you in this hour. Thank you very much, and keep well and keep safe.